The sun didn't just shine in Loma Cabrada. It punished. It beat down on the cracked earth until the whole town looked like it was holding its breath, waiting to die of thirst. The adobe walls of the chapel were blistered and peeling. Even the flies had given up, too tired to buzz around the old mule tied to the cantina post. But nothing in that town was as broken as Isla Monontoya. She stood barefoot on a splintered wooden platform in the middle of the plaza. Her wrists were folded in front of her, her eyes locked on the dirt below. She hadn't cried. Not today. The tears had run out last night, on the floor of the hut, while her father got drunk and scribbled her life away on the back of a tobacco invoice. He stood beside her now, Domingo Monontoya, waving that yellowed paper like a flag of surrender. His voice, thick with mezcal and hate, cut through the heat. 19 years old, he barked. Strong, obedient, for sale. A few men in the crowd chuckled. Some spat. The women, the ones who knew, just looked away. Isla didn't move. Her robe had slipped off her shoulder, exposing her skin to the sun, but she didn't fix it. What was the point? The crowd was silent. Not a shocked silence. It was the silence of a place that had seen too many bad things happen in the bright light of day and had learned not to blink. "We'll start the bid at 1 peso, Domingo shouted, as if he were selling a sack of bad corn. A man in a sweat-stained vest raised a lazy hand. 2, came a shout from a drunk near the well. The numbers climbed with a sick, steady rhythm. 5, 10, 17. Isela flinched with every one. Each number was another link in a chain being wrapped around her throat. Then a voice cut through the air. 60. It wasn't a shout. It didn't need to be. It was cold and sharp, and it made every single head in that plaza turn. He stepped out from the shade of the cantina. Elas Navarro. Tall and still, wearing a worn white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but there was no mistaking the weight in that one word. Even Domingo, her own father, blinked in surprise. 60 pesos, Elas said again, his voice flat. Cash. A murmur went through the crowd like a snake in the dust. Leaning against the wall, a man named Casio Ortega slowly pushed himself upright. He crushed his cigarette under his boot heel, his eyes narrowed into slits. He'd been so sure she was his. Domingo just grinned, his eyes glassy and greedy. Sold. Isela barely felt the hand on her arm. Elas had stepped onto the platform. He didn't grip her hard. He touched her lightly, the way you might touch the reins of a horse that's been beaten one too many times. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. She was just a thing that had been moved from one man's hands to another's. The wagon creaked as it rolled out of Loma Cabrada, leaving 2 shallow lines in the dust. Elas drove in complete silence, his hands steady, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Isela sat beside him, clutching the small bundle of clothes that was everything she owned in the world. Behind them, the town shrank and disappeared. The people who had watched her being sold just melted back into the heat. They said nothing. They did nothing. Finally, she couldn't take the silence anymore. She looked at the man beside her, at his weathered face half hidden by his hat. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracking. He didn't even glance her way. "Because no one else was going to." Her throat tightened. "You don't know me. Don't need to." That shut her up. The words were like a slap. Not cruel, just final. They rode on, the only sound the groan of the wheels and the buzz of cicadas in the scorched sagebrush. The sun bled across the sky, turning the whole world orange and then purple. They didn't speak again until the wagon stopped in front of a place called Rancho Las Cruces. It was a lonely stretch of land. A 2-story adobe house that looked like it had been there forever, a rusted windmill turning slowly in the wind, and nothing but empty horizon in every direction. Elas stepped down and tied the reins. He turned and offered her a hand. She hesitated, looking from his outstretched hand to the dark doorway of the house. He seemed to understand. "You weren't bought," he said, his voice low and rough. "You were rescued, that's all." Isela didn't believe him, not for a second, but his hand was still there, waiting, and it was the only hand being offered. She took it. The house smelled of cedar and dust and old memories. Elas led her to a small room in the east wing. The door creaked open. Inside, there was a simple bed with a hand-stitched quilt, a chair, and a small basin for water. The window had no glass, just wooden slats that let in the dry, sharp scent of the desert. "I'll be in the barn," Elas said, and then he was gone. She was alone. Isela sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers digging into the coarse fabric of the quilt. Her legs wouldn't stop trembling. She hated it. Hated feeling like an object, a piece of property. Was this man, Elas, any different from her father? Or was he just more patient? That night she couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house sounded like footsteps coming down the hall. Every time the wind rattled the slats on the window, she imagined a belt being unbuckled. She waited for the door to open, but it never did. Sometime after midnight, she heard a different sound, the slow, rhythmic creak of a rocking chair on the front porch. She got up quietly, crept to the window, and peeked through the slats. There he was, Elas Navarro, sitting on the porch in the dark, a bottle beside his chair, just rocking back and forth, staring out into the blackness. He wasn't sleeping either. He was watching, waiting. But for what? The morning came too fast. Her body ached from a tension that had nowhere to go. She washed her face at the basin, the water so cold it stole her breath. As she stepped out into the corridor, she nearly ran into a woman. She was older, with skin the color of red clay and dark, knowing eyes. She was wrapped in an earth-toned shawl and held a basket of herbs that smelled like sage and rain. "Ruth," the woman said, her voice as dry as the land itself. Isela just nodded, unable to speak. The woman's gaze lingered on her, taking in the faint bruises on her arms, the fear in her eyes. "You're safe here," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. "He doesn't speak much, but his hands are not cruel." "I didn't ask," Isela said, her voice barely a whisper. "You didn't have to." Ruth turned and walked away, the scent of sage following her down the hall like a ghost. Isela stood there, frozen. Something about the woman felt ancient, true. But safety? That was a word she no longer understood. Back in Loma Quebrada, Casio Ortega wasn't in the plaza. He was in the cool, dark shade of the cantina. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his coat pocket. It was a contract, signed by Domingo Monontoya. But that wasn't the important part. Below her father's name was another signature, a crude X marked in haste, the mark of her mother. Casio smiled, a slow, cold thing. 60 pesos buys you a few days, Navarro, he whispered to the empty room. But it doesn't buy you my property. He had a different piece of paper, a better one that proved Isela Monontoya had been his long before she ever stood on that platform. The silence at Rancho Las Cruces wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It was the kind of quiet that makes you strain to hear the sound of something breaking. Isela stood in the hallway, arms wrapped around herself, listening. She hadn't really slept. She'd just drifted in a state of high alert, waking at every sound. She hadn't heard Elas leave his room, but she knew he was gone. The man moved like a shadow. She walked into the main room and stopped. On the small kitchen table was a neatly folded linen napkin. When she unfolded it, she found a piece of warm cornbread, a hard-boiled egg, and a small canteen of fresh water. No note, no explanation, just food. The simple gesture felt more dangerous than a threat. It was a kindness she didn't trust. She pushed it away. She wouldn't eat it. Outside, the ranch looked just as empty as it felt. The windmill groaned. A few chickens scratched in the dirt. She found Alas out by the western fence line, mending a broken post, a hammer in one hand, his back already damp with sweat. He didn't look up as she approached. "You don't have to stay in that room," he said, his voice calm. "I wasn't locked in." He hammered a nail into the wood, one clean strike. "Didn't say you were." She stood there waiting, but he offered nothing else. No questions about her past, no demands for her future. It was maddening. It was as if he was waiting for her to break the silence, but didn't care if she ever did. "I'm not one of your horses," she finally snapped, the words tasting like rust. He set the hammer down. For the first time, he turned and looked directly at her. His eyes were dark, unreadable. "You weren't bought," he said, repeating the words from the day before. "You were rescued, that's all." The way he said it wasn't for her benefit. He was saying it because he believed it, and that was somehow more terrifying than if he'd been lying. That afternoon, she walked. She had to get out of the house, away from his suffocating silence. She wandered past the stables, over a small ridge of wind-blown rock, and found a faint trail leading into a grove of mesquite trees. And that's where she found her. Ruth. The old woman was kneeling beside a crooked row of plants. Some were thriving. Others looked half dead. "I told you you were safe," Ruth said, without looking up. Her voice sounded like sand scraping against stone. Isela stepped closer. "You didn't tell me you lived out here." "Didn't think I needed to." It wasn't a house. It was a hut, built of adobe and earth, with a doorway covered by old blankets. The garden around it was a chaotic mix of sage, aloe, lavender, and prickly pear, a place that grew things that knew how to fight. "Do you live alone?" Isela asked. Ruth finally looked up, her eyes sharp. "I live with whatever spirits haven't left yet." She smirked, a crack in her weathered face. "You're not the first broken girl to wash up on this land." The words were blunt, no pity, and for some reason that made it easier to breathe. Ruth stood, wiping dirt from her hands onto her skirt. "You want to feel safe? Stop hiding from the ground. Put your hands in the dirt. Work. Grow something. Or don't." She paused, her gaze intense. "But let me tell you something, girl. Silence isn't healing. It just means you've forgotten how to scream." The words echoed in Isela's head all the way back to the house. That night, she didn't hide in her room. She sat on the back step, the cool adobe against her spine, and watched the sky burn out. A bowl of bean stew Alas had left for her sat untouched at her side. She heard his boots on the packed earth before she saw him. He was holding an oil lamp, the flame dancing in the growing dark. He didn't sit next to her. He just stood in the doorway, a tall shadow. "I'm going to town tomorrow for supplies," he said. "If you need anything." "Freedom," she said, the word sharp. He didn't even blink. "I'm not keeping you." "No," she said, her voice low and bitter. "You're just waiting to see if I'm broken enough to stay on my own." He didn't deny it. That damn silence. It was worse than any argument. It was a wall she couldn't climb. Finally, he gave a single slow nod. "I don't want you broken," he said. "I want you breathing." He set the lamp on the ground beside her, leaving her in a small circle of light, and walked away into the darkness. The next morning, the air tasted like thunder. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, back towards Loma Quebrada. Ella stood by the stables, staring at the sky as if it owed him something. Isela came out onto the porch. "Will it rain?" "Maybe." She watched him for a long moment. "Why do you live out here, all alone?" He didn't turn. His voice was so quiet she barely heard it over the wind. "Because the ghosts are quieter out here." "What ghosts?" "The kind you bury," he said, "and still hear screaming." Before she could ask more, a boy on a dusty mule came riding up the road. He handed Alas a sealed envelope and rode off without a word. Isela watched as Elas looked at the seal. It was from Padre Madero, the priest in Loma Cabrada. She saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. He didn't open it in front of her. He took it into the barn. Later that night, she found him there. He was sitting on a bale of hay, reading the letter by the dim light of a lantern. His face was a mask of stone. "What is it?" she asked from the doorway. He looked up, his eyes sharp and guarded. "The priest. He wants me to come to town. Says there's paperwork, something your father signed." Her blood ran cold. It wasn't about her father. She knew it. It was about Casio Ortega. Elas didn't have to confirm it. His silence was the answer. That night, Isela sat on the steps, hugging her knees to her chest as Ruth's words ran through her mind. Silence isn't healing. It just means you've forgotten how to scream. And deep inside her, the screams were starting to build again. In the chapel in Loma Cabrada, Casio Ortega stood before the altar. He laid a document on the cool stone for Padre Madero to see. He lit a match, the scrape echoing in the empty church. "Isela Monontoya," he said, his voice smooth as poison. "She owes me a debt, in time and in blood." The first hint of dawn was a gray line on the horizon. Isela hadn't slept. She lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of that unopened letter as if it were a stone on her chest. Her father's signature, a piece of paper that had turned her into livestock. She got up and opened her door. The hallway smelled of cedar and dread. In the kitchen, a pot of coffee was already on the stove, and a second mug sat waiting. She didn't have to wonder who it was for. Through the window, she saw him. Elas was in the yard, chopping wood. The rhythmic thud of the axe was the only sound in the world. He moved with a brutal efficiency, as if he were trying to kill something with every swing. A man with 100 locked doors inside him. She poured 2 cups of coffee and walked outside. He glanced up as she approached, but didn't stop chopping. She held out the mug. "You still don't know what to do with me, do you?" He finally stopped, setting the axe down. He took the cup. "Don't think you're a problem that needs solving." The answer surprised her. She sat on the porch steps, the warm mug in her hands. She watched him drink his coffee, his eyes scanning the barren hills as if searching for an answer. The ranch still felt like a place where time had died, but something inside her had shifted. Something was waking up. Later that morning, she found herself drawn to the old storage shed behind the barn. It was dark and dusty, filled with forgotten tools and crates. In the back, under a burlap sack, was a heavy wooden trunk. She pried the rusty latch open. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them, curled and yellowed. A beautiful dark-haired woman laughing, holding a small boy. Elas, 10 years younger, leaning against a tree, the same woman at his side. They looked happy, untouched. A tear slid down Isela's cheek and dripped onto the photograph before she even realized she was crying. "Elena!" The voice came from the doorway. Elas was standing there, leaning against the frame, his face unreadable. "Your wife?" she whispered, though she already knew. He stepped into the shed and gently took the photo from her hand. "And Mateo." "The boy?" He nodded. "A fever took them. First the boy, then her, a week apart." He said it with no emotion, just flat facts, like fence posts hammered into hard ground. You didn't bury them here?" He shook his head. "Her family's land, in Zacatecas." There was no tremor in his voice. No hint of a crack in the wall, just a cold, hard finality. He had buried his family, and he had buried his heart right along with them. That afternoon, Ruth arrived. She didn't bring herbs this time, just herself. She found Isela sitting under the mesquite tree and sat down beside her. "You're not the same girl who got off that wagon," Ruth said. "I don't feel any different. That's how you know it's working." Ruth watched the wind stir up dust devils in the distance. Isola picked at a loose thread on her dress. "Can I ask you something? Why him? Why do you help Ellis?" Ruth was quiet for a long time. "Years ago," she finally said, "this town, led by Casio Ortega's father, decided my brother was a horse thief. They didn't have a trial. They just hung him from the old oak tree by the creek." Isola gasped. "The whole town watched," Ruth continued, her voice cold as stone, "and when it was over, they all went home, all except one man, Elas Navarro. He was just a boy then. He waited until dark, cut my brother down, and gave him a proper burial. Never said a word to anyone. Just did what needed to be done." The story settled in Isola's chest, heavy and profound. "He carries his ghosts," Ruth said, looking Isola straight in the eye. "But he does not become one. In this world, that matters." That night, a strange energy filled the house. Isola found Elas in the main room, cleaning his rifle. "I want to work," she said suddenly. He looked up. "You do work." "No, not just cooking and cleaning. I want to plant something. I want to grow something here." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "This land is hard, unforgiving." She met his gaze without flinching. "So am I." A flicker of something, respect, maybe even a smile, touched the corner of his mouth. "All right," he said. "We'll clear a patch by the well. Sunrise." The next day they worked. Side by side, they cleared rocks and broke the soil. It was the first time they moved as partners, not as rescuer and rescued. He showed her how to measure rows, how to feel the soil for moisture. By noon, her back ached and her hands were raw, but for the first time in her life, her chest felt light. She looked up once and caught him watching her. The look in his eyes wasn't pity, it was recognition. Ruth returned that evening with a collection of seed packets. "These are fighters," she said, handing Isola seeds for marigold, sage, and desert thyme. "They know how to survive." "Good," Isola said, closing her fist around them. "So do I. But peace is a fragile crop, and Loma Quebrada was a place that specialized in drought." 3 days later, the boy on the mule was back, riding harder this time. He carried another letter, another seal, another warning. Elas read it, his face grim. He folded it slowly and looked at Isola. The wall was back up in his eyes. "Your mother," he said, the words falling like stones. "She's at a convent in Zacatecas. She's sick." Isola's knees felt weak. "My mother?" She thought her mother had run off, abandoned her years ago. "She's alive," Elas confirmed. "The letter says she's asking for you." Isola stared at the dry, cracked earth beneath her feet. Her world, which had just started to feel solid, was splintering all over again. Her mother was alive, and she was asking for her, after all these years of silence. "I have to go," she whispered. Elas just nodded. In a dark room in the cantina, Casio Ortega lit a fresh cigar. He handed a stack of coins to a man with cold, empty eyes. "Don't follow him," Casio said, blowing a smoke ring toward the ceiling. "Follow her. I want to know everything." The road to Zacatecas was a dusty ribbon unwinding through a landscape of heat and rock. Isola's hands trembled on the wagon seat, but it wasn't fear. It was a strange, painful anticipation, like pressing on a bruise to see if it still hurts. 6 years. 6 years of silence, and now this. A letter from nuns. Ellis drove without a word, his shoulders set like stone. He was a man built for hard roads and bad news. She watched his profile, the hard line of his jaw. He didn't flinch when a rattlesnake slithered across their path. He just kept driving. "What if it's a trap?" she asked, the question hanging in the dry air. He didn't look at her. "It's not." "You sound so sure." "I've walked into enough traps to know what they look like." That was it. No more explanation. She hated the silence between them again. It wasn't comforting anymore. It was just a reminder of everything he wasn't telling her. A few miles later, she couldn't stand it. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to come with me." For the first time on the entire journey, he turned his head and met her eyes. "I know," he said, "but I am." The convent of Santa Nube was a white scar on a red hill, surrounded by dying trees. It was a place where women came to disappear. A nun with eyes as sharp as broken glass opened the heavy wooden door. "Sister Letitia," she said, "she is weak, but she is lucid. She asked for you." Isola's mouth was dry. The convent smelled of lemon balm and damp stone. She followed the nun down a long, dim hallway. Each footstep echoed. Then, a plain wooden door. The nun opened it and stepped aside. And there she was. Delphina. Her mother. So pale and fragile she looked like she was made of rice paper. Her eyes were sunken in bruised shadows. But they were her mother's eyes. Isola froze. The words she had practiced, the anger she had stored up for years, it all turned to ash in her throat. Her mother tried to smile. "Still frowning, just like your father." The words almost made Isola turn and walk out. "I didn't come for an apology," she said, her voice tight. "I came for my own peace." Delphina winced, trying to sit up straighter. "I know. I deserve your hate." "I thought he would kill us both if I stayed," Delphina whispered, her eyes glassy. "I thought if I disappeared, you'd be safer." "I wasn't safer." The silence in the room was suffocating. Isola didn't cry. She had used up all her tears in cellars and on auction blocks. She sat down on the chair by the bed. "I came because I needed to see your face when you said you left me," she whispered. "I needed to know if I was ever anything more than a burden." Her mother's face finally cracked. A single tear rolled down her pale cheek. She reached out a trembling hand. Isela didn't take it. Outside, Elas leaned against the wagon. He saw her coming down the steps, her back straight, her chin high. He didn't ask a single question. He just opened the wagon gate for her, and she climbed in. They rode for hours. When night fell, they made a small camp by a dried-up creek. After a silent meal of beans and jerky, she finally spoke. "Thank you," she said, staring into the flames of the fire. "For what?" "For not asking." He nodded. "Not my story to ask about." He stirred the embers with a stick. "What do you believe in, Elas?" she asked quietly. He thought for a moment. "The ground, horses, the weight of an axe in my hand, not much else." "Then why did you save me?" He dropped the stick and looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Because a soul is not a piece of property," he said, his voice rough. "It doesn't belong to your father, it doesn't belong to Cassio Ortega, and it doesn't belong to me." The words weren't just about her. She could hear the ghosts in his voice. Elena, Mateo, the family he couldn't save. She just nodded. For the first time, something passed between them that wasn't silence or suspicion. It was just a shared breath in the vast, dark desert. When they got back to the ranch, everything had changed. The wind was different, the horses were restless, and Ruth was waiting on the porch, her arms crossed, her face a thundercloud. "Someone's been on your land, Elas," she said. He knelt and examined the ground. Boot prints, too clean for a ranch hand. And by the barn post, the fresh ash from a cigar. Cassio. "I'll leave," Isola said immediately. "This is because of me." Ella stood up, his face hard. "No, this is because of him. He won't stop until he has me." His jaw clenched. "Then let him try. You don't understand what he's capable of." "I understand more than you think," he snapped. Then, his voice softened. "More than you think." Ruth stepped forward. "You run now. The man wins forever. He doesn't just get you. He gets your fear. For the rest of your life." Isela looked out at the small patch of earth where they had planted the seeds. What if staying just made everything worse? Ruth seemed to read her mind. "So does running," she said quietly. That night, Cassio sent his first message. It wasn't a letter. It was a dead chicken, its neck broken, hung by its feet from the new fence post. The blood was still warm. There was no note. There didn't need to be. Elas took it down and buried it without a word. Isela stood on the porch, her fists clenched so tight her nails dug into her palms. The message was clear. You are mine. You have always been mine. But something inside her had hardened. She was done being owned. She was done being afraid. Miles away, in the dim light of the chapel, Padre Madero looked down at the contract Cassio had presented. "She is not property, Cassio." Cassio just smiled. "You want to argue the law, Padre? Or do you want to argue with the man who owns this town?" He tapped the signature line. "Either way, she's coming home." The soil was hard, but Isela's will was harder. She spent the next day on her knees in the garden, pulling weeds, her fingers raw, her blouse soaked with sweat. The physical work was a relief. It was a pain she could control. Elas worked nearby, saying nothing, but she could feel his presence. His silence was no longer a threat. It was a space, a quiet place where she could finally start to breathe. The marigolds had started to bud, tiny, defiant bursts of gold. Ruth appeared at midday as she always did, like she grew out of the earth itself. She knelt beside Isela and held out a handful of seeds. "Desert mint," she said. "Smells like nothing, but when the rain comes, it sings." "What if the rain never comes?" Isela asked. Ruth smirked. "Then you water it with what you have. Sweat, tears, blood if you have to." Her eyes grew serious. "Even scorched earth can bloom, girl, if someone is brave enough to stay." The words hit Isela like a physical blow. "I'm tired of bleeding to prove I'm alive." Ruth reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind Isela's ear. Her touch was surprisingly gentle. "Then stop bleeding," she whispered, "and start blooming." That evening, the storm that had been threatening for days finally arrived. The wind came first, howling across the plains, kicking up walls of dust. Elas moved quickly, securing the barn, tying down anything that could fly away. The sky turned a bruised purple. Inside, Isela sat by the fire, holding the letter from the convent. She hadn't thrown it away. "You all right?" Elas asked, stepping inside, the wind whipping at his back. "I don't know," she said honestly. He poured 2 small glasses of mezcal and handed one to her. She took it. "I keep thinking," she said, staring into the flames, "if I work hard enough, I can forget." "Forget what?" "The sound of my father's belt, the feeling of hands that wouldn't stop." Her voice cracked. "The way they all looked at me like I was already dead." Elas took a slow drink. "You're not broken. I feel broken." "Then feel it," he said, his voice low and intense. "Feel it, and then you get up and you live anyway." 3 days later, the garden came to life. Tiny green shoots pushed through the hard soil. The marigolds opened. It was a riot of color in a world of brown and gray. Isela knelt in the dirt and laughed, a real, full-throated laugh. Ruth watched from the porch, nodding. Elas came and stood beside her. "She's different," he said. "She's becoming," Ruth corrected him. "It's always a messy business." Later that day, another letter arrived from Padre Madero. Elas read it, and this time the look on his face was cold fury. He didn't show her the letter. He just went about his chores with a grim purpose. He sharpened knives. He checked the rifle he kept behind his headboard. That night on the porch, she asked him, "Do you believe in healing?" He was quiet for a long time, watching the storm clouds retreat. "Only when it doesn't ask you to forget," he finally said. She nodded. "Me too." The uneasy peace lasted 2 more days. Then Cassio sent his next message. They found one of the horses, the old roan gelding, down by the creek. Its throat had been cut. There were no tracks, no sign of a struggle, just a silent, brutal act of violence. Elas buried the horse himself. When Isola came to help, he didn't speak. He just handed her a shovel. Ruth arrived as they were patting down the last of the dirt. She dropped a bundle of burning sage onto the fresh grave. "He's making promises in town," she said, her voice grim, "telling men he'll share the land once he reclaims his property." Elas's hands were caked with red dirt. It looked like blood. "He wants a war," Ruth said, "the kind that starts with paper and ends with guns." Isela met Elas's eyes over the grave. "I have to go back," she said. "Back where?" "To the convent. There's something I forgot to ask my mother. Something I need to know before he tries to burn this all to the ground." Elas hesitated for only a second. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I'm done hiding." The next morning, as they saddled the horses, Ruth pressed a small leather pouch into Isela's hand. "For luck," she said. "What's in it?" "Whatever you need it to be." From the balcony of the cantina, Cassio Ortega watched them ride out. A man beside him, a hired gun from Sonora, spat into the dust. "They running again?" Cassio shook his head, a slow smile spreading across his face. "No," he said. "She's going to say goodbye." He crushed his cigarette. "And when she comes back, I'll be waiting to say hello." When the white walls of the convent came into view, Isola felt a cold resolve settle over her. This time, she wasn't coming for closure or forgiveness. She was coming for ammunition. Sister Letitia let them in without a word, her eyes lingering on the rifle slung across Elas's back. Her mother was sitting up in bed, looking stronger than before. "You came back," Delfina said. Isola didn't waste time. "The contract," she said, her voice hard. "The one Cassio has. I need you to tell me everything." Her mother's eyes darted away. "Domingo, your father. He made me sign something. He said it was for a debt. I didn't read it. He was drunk. He hit me." He put the pen in my hand. "You signed me away without even reading it?" Isela's voice was a low growl. "I thought he was going to kill us both," Delfina cried. "He did kill me," Isela said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He just did it slower." Delfina began to sob. "I have lived with the shame every single day." "I'm not asking for your shame," Isela said, stepping closer to the bed. "I'm asking you to find your courage. If it comes to it, will you stand in the plaza and tell everyone the truth?" Her mother looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "In front of the whole town? I'm asking you to stand with me, just once." After a long agonizing silence, Delfina gave a single shaky nod. "I will." Outside, Elas was waiting. "Did you get what you came for?" "Yes," Isela said. "She'll testify." "It won't come to that," he grunted. "Cassio won't wait for a trial." "I'm not waiting either," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "His power only exists because everyone is too afraid to fight back. It's time someone lit a match." He studied her, a long, intense look. "You're not like Elena," he said finally. Isola stiffened. "You're stronger," he clarified. "She survived by hiding. You survive by becoming something they can't bury." He paused. "It's time to go home." The next day, the plaza in Loma Quebrada was tense. Word had spread. Cassio was making his move. People gathered in silence, their hands hidden under their ponchos, their eyes watchful. Ruth was the first to arrive, standing like a statue by the old well. Then Elas, his rifle held loosely at his side, his eyes scanning the rooftops. Then came Isola. She wore a simple blue dress. Her hair was down. When she stepped into the center of the plaza, a hush fell over the crowd. Cassio arrived last, flanked by 2 armed men. He was smiling. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying across the square. "Looks like the little bird wants an audience." "I want the truth," Isola said, her voice clear and steady. "The truth?" Cassio laughed. "The truth is, you belong to me." "No." The word was weak, but it cut through the tension. Every head turned. Delphina, her mother, was stepping out of the crowd, supported by two nuns. Cassio's smile faltered. "She was never yours to own," Delphina said, her voice gaining strength. "That contract was signed under threat. There was no witness. There was no consent." Cassio sneered. "She's a dying woman, not a lawyer." "And you're a vulture, not a husband," Ruth snapped from across the plaza. Elas took a single step forward. "You want to test this, Ortega? You try to cross this square with that paper, you won't be leaving with it." Cassio gestured to one of his men. "The law is on my side. We'll let the priest decide." "I already have." Padre Madero emerged from the chapel. He held up a different document, one with an official seal. "This nullifies any prior contract," the priest announced, his voice ringing with authority. "Under the laws of God and man, the debt is void due to coercion and immoral conduct." Cassio's face turned to thunder. He stared at the priest, at Delphina, at Elas, and finally at Isola. "You think this is over?" he snarled. Elas didn't move. "No," he said, his voice deadly calm. "But you're not the one who gets to write the ending." Cassio's eyes were pure poison. He gave a short, ugly laugh, turned, and walked away. But just before he disappeared into the cantina, he looked back over his shoulder at Isola and mouthed two words. "Not yet." That night, the rain finally came. A real cleansing storm. It hammered down on the roof of the ranch house, washing the dust from the world. Isola stood out in the garden, her face turned up to the sky, letting it wash her clean. Ruth watched her from the porch. "He'll be back," she said. Isola didn't open her eyes. "I know." "Are you afraid?" She shook her head, a slow smile spreading across her face as the cold rain streamed down her cheeks. "No," she whispered to the storm. "I'm ready." The wind that came a week later was wrong. It was hot and carried the smell of something burning far away. Ruth felt it first. She was in the garden, and the desert mint leaves began to tremble in her hand. Not from the wind. She turned slowly, her eyes fixed on the eastern ridge. Her voice was a low, urgent whisper. "They're coming." Inside, Elas looked up from the table where he was oiling his rifle. He didn't ask who. He stood, slid a shell into the chamber, and handed the revolver to Isola. She took it. Her hands were steady. A sudden, unnatural quiet fell over the ranch. The chickens went silent. The wind died. It was the silence before a lightning strike. Isola checked the revolver, her movements sure and practiced. She had spent the last week learning to stand, learning to aim, learning to fight. The first rider appeared on the ridge, a dark silhouette against the blood-red sunset. Then another, and another, 4 of them. Cassio Ortega rode at the front. He wasn't hiding. He was wearing a red duster coat and a smirk that looked like it had been carved on his face with a knife. He and his men reined in their horses just outside the yard. "Evening," Cassio called out, his voice slick with confidence. Elas stood in the open doorway, his rifle held easy at his side. "You've been warned, Ortega." Cassio laughed. "Warned? Yes. Listened. Not my style." He leaned forward on his saddle horn. "I've come for my property. Where is she?" Isola stepped out from the shadows of the house to stand beside Elas, shoulder to shoulder. "I'm right here," she said, her voice ringing out in the quiet. Cassio's smirk twitched. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her to be standing there, armed and unbroken. "You look different." "I am," she said. "I'm not yours anymore." His smile vanished completely. "Oh, little bird," he said, his voice dropping to a silken threat. You never stopped being mine. You just needed to be reminded. He gave a signal to one of his men. From a rear horse, they dragged a body, tied at the wrists, and threw it to the ground. It was Santiago, Ruth's young nephew. His face was bruised and bloody. They found him 2 towns over, Cassio said, enjoying the shock on their faces. Thought he'd be safer away from here. Let him go, Isella said, her voice shaking with rage. You come with me, and maybe he lives to see sunrise. Isella took a step forward. Ellis grabbed her arm. Don't! She looked at him, her eyes blazing. We protect our own, she said, or none of this means anything. He held her gaze for a heartbeat, then let go. She walked to the edge of the porch, her revolver held down at her side. Let him go now, she called out. And I'll come down. Cassio tilted his head. Still playing the saint? No, she said. Just tired of watching good people bleed for me. Cassio gave the signal. They cut Santiago's ropes and he slumped to the dirt, groaning but alive. Isella stepped off the porch and into the yard. Cassio dismounted, walking slowly toward her. You really think this is over? I know it is, she said. And then she moved. Faster than he could react, she kicked up a cloud of dust and spun, not toward him, but toward his man on the right, the one with the shotgun. The revolver in her hand barked once, twice. The second shot caught the man in the thigh. He screamed and went down. In the same instant, Elas's rifle cracked, and the man on Cassio's left crumpled, clutching a shattered shoulder. Ruth, moving with surprising speed, threw a clay jar filled with burning herbs and pepper into the face of the third rider, who shrieked and fell from his horse. Cassio lunged for Isella, his face a mask of fury. He grabbed her arm, twisting it. You're dead! She jammed the barrel of the revolver into his chest. They were locked together, eye to eye. You don't get to touch me, she snarled. Ever again. She pulled the trigger. Click. The chamber was empty. Cassio's lips peeled back in a triumphant grin. Should have counted your bullets, little bird. But he never finished the thought. The butt of Elas's rifle came down hard on the back of his head. Cassio dropped to the dirt like a sack of rocks. They didn't kill him. They tied him up, along with his wounded men. By morning, they were delivered to the jail in the next county, along with sworn statements from Isella, Elas, Ruth, and a now conscious Santiago. Faced with a mountain of evidence and a town that had finally turned on him, Cassio Ortega's reign was over. That night, the house at Rancho Las Cruces was quiet. It was the silence of a held breath finally released. Isella sat by the fire. Ellis came and leaned against the door frame, watching her. You could have run, he said. She looked up. I almost did, 100 times, but you always stayed. She smiled, a small, tired thing. I guess I finally planted roots. He reached into his coat and pulled out the old, cracked photograph of Elena and Mateo. He walked over and placed it gently on the mantelpiece above the fire. The ghosts are quiet now, he said. She stood and came to his side. She looked from the photograph to his face. No one ever really replaces what they've lost. But sometimes, if they're lucky, they find a way to build something new on the broken ground. The last storm of the season rolled in, soaking the land that had once refused to grow anything. Isella and Elas stood on the porch, watching the rain fall, not as a threat, but as a promise. The healing had begun. Morning came soft, washing the world in pale gold light. Isella stood barefoot in the garden. The marigolds were a blaze of color. The desert mint released a sharp, clean scent into the cool air. She knelt, pressing her palms flat against the damp earth. It felt solid. It felt like home. Ellis came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee and a small stack of letters. Mail, he said. One was from the convent. Her mother, Delphina, had passed away in her sleep 2 nights before. Her last words had been a prayer, and Isola's name. Isola folded the letter and put it in her pocket. There were no tears. The wound had been open for so long, and now it was finally closed. Another letter was from the regional council. Casio Ortega had been sentenced to 25 years in a federal prison. No parole. The town of Loma Quebrada was finally free. She let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for her entire life. It wasn't justice, not really, but it was peace. Weeks turned into months. The ranch changed. Santiago, now fully healed, helped Ellis build a new wing onto the house. A school, he told her. A place for the girls this world tried to throw away. They started to arrive one by one, girls with old eyes and silent tongues. They didn't talk much at first. They just watched Isela. They watched her work the soil, mend the fences, tend to the horses. They watched her take the scars of her past and build a future with them. And slowly, they started to ask for seeds of their own. One evening, as the sun set, Elas sat on the porch, reading. Ruth was humming an old song by the garden gate. Inside, Isela was teaching a young girl named Marisol how to stitch a blanket. "You were like us once, weren't you?" the girl asked quietly. Isela paused, the needle still in her hand. "Worse," she said. "What changed?" Isela looked at the girl's determined face, at her small hands trying so hard to learn. "I stopped waiting for someone else to save me," she said, "and I started planting my own garden." The first rain of the next summer was gentle. It fell on the new roof of the schoolhouse. It fell on the rows of thyme and marigold. It fell on the small, simple stone Elas had carved and placed by the garden gate. It read, "Elena and Mateo, never forgotten." Isela stood beside him that day, her head resting on his shoulder. They never spoke of marriage, never spoke of vows. Their love was a quiet thing, grown in hard soil, sturdy and resilient. It was a language of shared work, of comfortable silence, of knowing that home wasn't a place you found, but a place you built together. The land remembered the blood. It remembered the fear, but it held those memories the way the earth holds the roots of a tree, turning them into something that could reach for the sun. This wasn't a story about a rescue. It was a story about reclamation, about a woman who was sold, who was broken, but who refused to be bought. She learned that true freedom isn't the absence of chains. It's the strength to grow even after you've been cut down. If you believe that the strongest things can grow in the most broken places, then hit that subscribe button, because there are always more stories of survival waiting to be told.